how obedience to God and obedience to His Word bring His blessing, and then in all three instances, either through them or their children, their disobedience kind of brought their downfall. It's a sad story in some cases, a beautiful story in others. There in our introduction, the first thing that Brother Vestal points out is that we're in a transition period in the Old Testament, in Israel's history. The time that, as we've just recently studied, that Israel was judged by the judges. We're going to get up to the last judge, that being Samuel this morning, and then the people are going to cry out, "We want a king," because everybody else had a king. A good example for us to be careful what you ask for sometimes, because God gave them what they wanted. It says here, 1st and 2nd Samuel mark a transition in Israel's history from the period of Judges to the period of the Kings, and that from Judges era to the United Kingdom. Note Judges 21 and 1 Kings chapter 8. Part number 3 there, 1 Samuel, choosing less than the best. And it talks about the judgeship of Samuel through those first 7 chapters, he being the last judge, the kingship of Saul, chapters 8 through 15, and that's going to actually turn out to be a disaster for him and Israel. And then finally the kingship of David, which there's so many things that we remember about David. First of all, he was a man after God's own heart. We learned that. So many good things that David did, so many good things that David wrote that we're able to read now. But once again, he messed up. He messed up, and it dearly cost him. And we'll talk more about that here in just a little bit. It says all 3 lives overlap, but in each section given, the one named is doubtless the main character, and that's absolutely true. We're going to have some more characters that are very, very interesting. We'll talk about that as we go. Part 4 there, 2 Samuel, from triumphs to troubles. First 10 chapters is triumphs. The last chapters 11 through 24 are the troubles of Israel. And as you see the asterisk there below, it's all due to sin. All due to sin. They really, really enjoyed God's blessing when they were obedient, and they really had it tough when they choose to do otherwise. In our background, it says there in 1 Samuel, there are 3 prominent characters. We've already discussed that just a little bit. Samuel, the first 7 chapters. Saul, chapters 8 through 15. David, chapters 16 through 31. There are going to be some interesting stories about some ladies. I found it interesting that we recently just finished the study of the book of Ruth, and how being close to God, doing what God said, being very prayerful, the importance and the power of prayer are going to be a very important part of our lesson we're about to study. Ruth was the epitome of that. Samuel's mother, Hannah, we're going to talk about in this lesson, is another great example of the power of prayer and the importance of that. Samuel means his name is God, the name of God, heard of God, or ask of God. The authorship is anonymous, but most likely written by Samuel, at least in the first part, because there in the 25th chapter, his death is mentioned there. Yes, ma'am. That's right.
But he is definitely not anonymous.
What now?
God is not anonymous.
Anonymous, that a girl, yeah. Yeah, it does. We spoke before, as Miss Mary mentions this morning. Sometimes we get wrapped around the axle in things that don't matter. Who wrote chapters 1 through 25 and who wrote chapters 25 through the rest of 2 Samuel. Does it matter? It was inspired by God. So whoever put pen to paper, they were doing what God was putting in their mind. So Miss Mary is exactly right. God is the author, whoever was putting pen to paper. Chapter 10 does mention that Samuel wrote a book, part B. Part C, I found it very interesting. Chapters 10 and 19 mention a school of prophets of which Samuel apparently was the head. I did some research through some commentaries, and a lot of people think that this was one of Samuel's greatest works, as he started this school and was the head of it for prophets. It does mention that a couple of times, and we might hit that later. Book could have been authored by several men, as it mentions in 1 Chronicles chapter 29. Like we've already talked about, it really doesn't matter. It was written by God. Time period, 1 Samuel covers a period of about 94 years from the birth of Samuel to the death of Saul. 2 Samuel records the major events from David's 40-year rule. Both of these books were originally one book. Been separated since the time of the Septuagint. So from what I read in the original Hebrew, there was no 1st and 2nd Samuel. It was just Samuel. And then when it was translated, for lack of a better word, into the Greek, later on they decided to separate the book. Interesting thought. I also found it interesting when reading about that the prophets that were to come, rather than being a prophet, they were called seers. Y'all have ever heard that before? Anyhow, learn something new every time we read. Let's see here. Samuel covers a period of about 94 years from his birth to the death of Saul. 2 Samuel recovers David's 40-year rule. I've already read that. I've already read part 5. We're on number 6, aren't we? The fact that whoever wrote 1st and 2nd Samuel used sources should not prove troubling. We're not going to get into that because we just talked about that. It don't matter. Number 7, that these books would be named for Samuel is not surprising either. Talking about the key characters of the period, last the 15 judges in first in prophetic order, the kingmaker, Samuel being a national leader like Moses. 3 great leaders that we've studied about so far in this Old Testament survey. Abraham being the first, Moses being the second. No, that's backwards. And then Samuel finally being the last. And he is mentioned several times as a great leader like Moses. Historically, a divine origin of the Davidic dynasty and the role of prophets or seers from judges to kings. Doctrinally, from 1 Samuel chapter 15, which is the story, long story short, of David being anointed there in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Christological use of the word anoint for the first time in the Old Testament, there in chapter 2, would serve as basis for the Messiah. Samuel as a prophet and priest. David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So there we go. That's kind of our introduction. Now we'll get into the gist of our lesson. Judgeship of Saul, chapters 1 through 7. The birth and the youth of Samuel, there first of all in chapters 1 and 2. We mentioned just a minute ago Samuel's mother. Samuel's mother, and I bet there are some ladies in the congregation this morning that can relate to this. Samuel's mother was unable to have children. Her name was Hannah. And she prayed to God that if he would bless her with a child, that she would dedicate the life of that child to God. And she did exactly what she said. She became pregnant. She bore a son. They named him Samuel. I think, from what I read, she raised him until he was weaned. And then he went to who? Was it Eli that he studied under? I think so. And Eli, the priest, raised and taught Samuel from that point forward. But his mother's influence was a strong part of his life. And a great, great story of the power of prayer, the necessity of prayer, and how doing what's right has its blessing. The call and office. So I don't know how many of you have ever studied about how God called to Samuel. Apparently he was asleep there one night. He hears this voice. He assumes, I believe, that it's Eli that's calling to him. And it happens 2 or 3 times. And he talks to Eli about it, and Eli tells him, he said, you need to listen. This is God talking to you. And so that's the way Samuel's service began. Chapters 4 through 7, the times in Acts there that it talks about. You remember we mentioned a lot of highs and lows to all these books that we're studying right now. Well, this is one of the lows. The Philistines actually capture the ark and remove it from Israel. But as God does, after Israel had kind of learned their lesson a little bit, the Philistines decided that that ark was not anything that they wanted. They couldn't bring it back fast enough. So they returned that ark to Israel, which in turn brought blessing back on Israel and took the pressure off the Philistines because they did that. I'm kind of rattling on. You guys jump in there at any time you like. Part 2 there, the kingship of Saul. So we mentioned Israel had never had a king. They had been, first it was the patriarchs, I guess, and Moses, and then the judges. I kind of said that backwards, but the elders, as an example of who generally messes up everything, the elders came to Samuel and said, we want a king. We want a king. Everybody else got a king. We want a king. So God says, all right, you want a king? I'll give you a king. And he gave them this guy named Saul. Went pretty good at first until Saul decided that his way was way better than God's way. Once again, down the hill we go because of man's disobedience. No. much like, I don't know how many of you are able to be in here I think it was Tim was teaching a couple of weeks ago, and he was giving an example of how we choose who we listen to a lot of times. And perfect example, that didn't go right. So anyway, he disobeyed God. Chapters 13 through 15 there, it says the Spirit of God left him. He ended up trying to kill, do you remember who? David. He sure did. He ended up trying to kill David, who would serve as the next king. And in chapter 28, I found it interesting that he sought the counsel of what we would consider a witch. So he looked for help everywhere, I guess, except where he needed to be looking for help from. Now we move on to what starts out as a great story, the Kingship of David. In chapters 16 and 17, he was announced by Samuel. He was chosen by God. It was a pretty interesting process by which he was chosen. If I remember correctly, David's dad was summoned to bring all his boys in there. They run them through the line one at a time. The very least, the youngest of which was David. When he came through there, God said, that's him right there. We understand it, he was a good-looking little fella, freckle-faced, ruddy, they called it at the time. But anyway, it's a cool story. We absolutely can't hit much of all this anyway. Chapter 17, there is one of the coolest stories in the Bible. They were at war with these Philistines, and most all of you know the story that his parents sent him down there with some food, and this big old giant Philistine guy was standing on the hill hollering out, who's going to face me? And little old skinny David come up there and let me go get him, and he ended up killing him with a rock. Actually, did he kill him with a rock? Yeah, kind of, but what killed him? God. Another in and of itself story is how very little that's accomplished by anybody, us, me especially, is accomplished because of self. It's accomplished because of God being with us. And when we have failures in our life, many times it's because we don't include God like we should. It says he was acknowledged by Jonathan there in chapter 18. Is a great story of David and Jonathan and their friendship together there. Attacked by Saul. We mentioned earlier that Saul tried to kill David. That happens down there past chapter 20 in our lesson. Jealousy obviously played a big part in that. There on page 4, we talk about how the good part of David's life, the triumphs of David, the fame in the first 10 chapters, how he reigns in Hebron of Judah for 7.5 years there in chapters 1 through 4, and reigns in Jerusalem over all Israel for 33 years. So when did it go bad for David? This is an open-ended question, and we ain't going until somebody tells me.
We took a nightly stroll.
When he wasn't busy.
Boy, I'm getting some good ones here. So most of us are familiar with a story that he goes out on what I'm guessing is like a balcony, and he's looking down on this roof, and there is this, I'm assuming, beautiful woman bathing on top of the roof. I've always wondered about that story. What was her name, by the way? Reckon she knew that getting a bath on top of the roof might draw some attention. You know, I've often thought that poor little girl, and then I got to thinking about it, of all places to take a bath. Apparently there were some buildings around them that were taller than hers, but anyway, that may be another story for another day, but I tell you what that is. We've talked about Ruth and Hannah, haven't we, and how always doing right led to God's blessing. And now, while we continue to study about ladies apparently getting naked and taking on a bath on God's roof, would ultimately cost her what? Her husband. She's going to become pregnant by David, and then the child dies because of her sin. Their sin, excuse me. Tom said he wasn't busy, was he? Too much idle hands are a devil's workshop. Have y'all ever heard that? Idle hands are a devil's workshop. Might be something for us to remember. So how does David find out he messed up?
Story about a little lamb.
That is exactly right. The story about his little lamb. Let me just flip over there and, well, there ain't no need in us reading that whole thing. Nathan comes to David, and he tells him this story of somebody that really did somebody wrong, and David was like, well, who did that? They ought to, tell me who did it. And he said, well, it's you. You are who I'm talking about. And he was sorrowful then. He was sorrowful then. Do you think David found forgiveness from God? Yeah. Were there still consequences to be paid for the sin? Yeah. So a lot of times we need to understand, I hate to bring this up, but if nobody in here but Melford appreciates me, he'll appreciate this. In one of our favorite movies, a guy gets baptized, and he comes walking out of there and says, come on in, boys, the water is fine. Neither man nor God has got anything on me now. Well, he was a fugitive from justice, and his friend says, well, God may forgive you, but the state of Mississippi may not feel quite so accommodating. So sometimes, even though we can find forgiveness, and we can find forgiveness, there are certain consequences for our actions, whether we're forgiven or not. And that is the case here with the suffering of the nation as well as the death of that child because of that sin.
You know, James, we have a lot of people commit heinous crimes and they go to prison. But when they get there, a lot of them learn the truth.
That is absolutely right.
They still have to suffer the consequences of the crime.
Miss Mary brings up an excellent point. One of the greatest serial killer stories of our time was, I think the guy's name was Jeffrey Dahmer. Ended up in a Bible study there in prison. I mean, this guy, if I remember right, killed people and ate them. Ended up getting baptized. I'm certainly not going to say he wasn't forgiven. You know, his sin separated him from God, and Jesus reconciled him to God, just like our sin separates us from God, and Jesus reconciles us back to God. Did he still have to die in prison? Yeah. So Same story. Thank you, Mary. His suffering, part C, we've already talked about there, that the child had to die in his house, just like Samuel and Saul. Sin brought on suffering. Sometimes I sit back and think, I wonder how much trouble I've been through that could have been avoided had I just lived better, talked better, acted better. You never know. You know, God disciplines those that he loves. And if you give God less reason to discipline you, there you go. It's also a great lesson here that with these men, not only did they have to suffer because of their sin, but their families had to suffer. Their nation had to suffer. Sin can have consequences that reach far beyond us. We could absolutely, Kenneth. That's a great. We need a positive here. Righteousness reaches far beyond us as well, via our example and our influence and our teaching. Great thought.
Do you think that something you're going to do won't affect anybody else, or just you? That's not true.
That's not true. That's not true. And I have heard that a lot in my life. Well, I don't know why I have to wear a seatbelt. If I'm in a wreck and die, it don't bother anybody but me. Well, what about your family? You know, I heard about seatbelts and motorcycle helmets, and I'm not debating whether they're right or wrong, but the guy I eat lunch with, that's the two things he likes to fuss about, so me and him fuss about that. Sin has its effect. We get on down there to part 3, the prominent subjects. We talk about Hannah. We mentioned earlier her sorrow because she couldn't have a child, her song because God blessed her. It says it's rare to see such godliness in any period, but note 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1, and it is a story of a very special lady that didn't do anything monumental as far as, like we talked about, Samuel starting the school of prophets, or David or Saul being a great king, but she is mentioned in one of the oldest books in the world as being a hero of faith, simply because she just trusted God, believed in God, had faith in God, and did what was right. You know, apparently she was a very righteous lady, and then she made a promise to God, and she fulfilled that promise. It's a really cool story.
No, but that would not be an easy thing to do with that lady.
I don't expect so. I don't know. Like I said, there was 55 chapters to read in today's lesson, so I hadn't covered it all. I don't know if she was near enough that she had some association, or if she was completely cut off. I honestly don't know the answer to that. But if she was completely cut off, that was very difficult, and it took a large measure of faith to do what she did. Right. Well, I hope so. It's
If she lived today, she would have made a good first lady president.
yes, she would have. Yes, she would have. Whew, we sure not gonna get into that, Miss Mary. We're moving right along. Eli made terrible mistakes by not properly training his own sons, but greatly contributed to Samuel, and that is part of the story, the kind of like what we were just talking about. That was Samuel's teacher. Don't hear about any great terrible things that he did, but his boys were awful. Some of the things it lists off that they did, they were awful. Did their sin affect their dad and that nation, that community? Yeah, yes it did, to a great extent. So a lot of times, don't just think what we do just affects us. So not only is this a story of how close we can be to God due to our faithfulness and our obedience to His Word, but it's also a story in that respect on our influence as parents. And you know, I don't know that story there. If he might have been a good parent and them boys just went the wrong way, I don't know. But it was devastating, the effect that their sin had. They were unsaved, regarded as the Belial of God, stole offerings from God, bullied the people, committed adultery in the tabernacle, and caused the people to transgress. So it was a hot mess there in that house for quite a bit. Page 5, Samuel, his timely appearing and educational work in the moral and religious lives of people make him a great man of faith. We've mentioned that school of prophets that he apparently started and was head of is mentioned twice there in the books of Samuel. And here we go. It is the elders of the people who ask for a king. Deliberate but wrong. They forgot God. Once again, they decided that what God had established, there was a better way. There was a better, look at these other nations. They got kings. That's the reason they're doing so good. We want a king. Can you hear us being like that? Wanting things to change to suit us sometimes? I do. And it's scary.
Want to be like everybody else.
Absolutely. It's the downfall of mankind. Wanting to be like everybody else instead of wanting to be like God wants us to be sometimes. This is a great example of that. Every time. Wisdom of God and the wisdom of man. I don't know. That is exactly right, Kenneth. But we know better, don't we? Nah, we're not included in that group by and large. But the sad saga of Saul, there in number 5. Things looked promising at first, but once again, he knew better than God. He wanted to do things the way he wanted to do it. So that, therefore, I think it said actually, I may not get this right word for word, but the Spirit of God left him. He was on his own because of his disobedience. To let self get the upper hand is to miss the best and court the worst. That's a great phrase. To let self get the upper hand is to miss the best and court the worst. God looks upon the heart. Several examples there. It's also a story of the value of two true friends, and specifically there it's talking about Jonathan and David. Proverbs chapter 18 talks about the value of a friend. John chapter 15, Jesus says, "You're my friends if you do what I command." I remember in the Gospels, speaking of Jesus, he had a special friend, didn't he? It appeared he and John had a very unique relationship. At one time, he's mentioned the servant that Jesus loved, I believe. And I know when Jesus was on the cross, to me, the greatest compliment that he ever gave John is he kind of made him the overseer of his mother as he was dying there on the cross. And that was a special moment. Tells you a lot. And I love worshiping here because my very closest friends are in this building this morning, and the value of that to me is beyond explaining. Mainly because I have friends that try to bump me in the right direction instead of try to bump me in the wrong direction. The power of youth, when one trusts in God, gives us several great examples there. Timothy, for instance, David, obviously, is who we're talking about now. But you know what came to my mind when I read that is some of the examples that we've seen right here in this church, and some of the young people and the extraordinary things that they did. And these young people now that I see getting up here and teaching these adult Bible lessons on Wednesday night. Kenneth and Dan and Jay and I had this big plan that we needed to start training some of these young guys to teach these Bible lessons, but we had no idea that when they got up here they were going to make us look bad because they're already better than we are. Anyway, that's fine. Reaping what's sown. We know all about that. The sin of Uzzah. We hadn't talked about that. Melford and I mentioned how many great stories are contained in these two letters here. What did Uzzah do that got him struck down?
He touched the ark.
He did. There was two sides to that story. Was Uzzah supposed to be beside that ark anyway? God said, don't touch it. Now, good intentions, man's way of thinking, they kind of stumble, that old ark kind of leans. He thought, I better grab this rascal. But what did God told him? Keep your hands off of it. So what was his reward? God struck him dead.
How did David react?
Amen. Amen.
David got mad.
He did. He did. So even though something seems right in our mind, if it's in opposition to what this says, it's wrong. Does that seem right? That thing's kind of trying to fall and he grabs and steadies it. Yeah, it makes sense. That's earthly wisdom, isn't it? That's the right thing to do. But it ain't what God said to do.
James tells there were certain people that were that close to the ark again.
And he wasn't one of them. So he was somewhere he wasn't really supposed to be to start with. That was my point.
Well, wouldn't you say that was the human side?
Man,
Wouldn't you say that is the human side?
yeah, we know better. We know where we need to be, don't we?
And two, if God had let him live, then that would have. Yeah.
That's it. That's it. Yeah, why pay attention to God? Yeah, that ain't how it happened though, is it? You know, I missed at the very front of this lesson a large part of what 1st and 2nd Samuel are is so many people want to think about, and me included, when I think about God, I think about God's love and God's mercy. Well, these two books are full of God's discipline, God's vengeance. There's more to God than this big warm fuzzy feeling in our heart that he's all, while he is a loving God and he does desire all of us to seek repentance, when we go against his will, it's fixing to go bad for us. Is that the second whistle? All right then. We'll whoop out the last little bit of that next week, and we'll get on to some kings. I guess we'll start on number 11.